afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In continuation with the series on basic sociology, in today's lecture I am going to discuss on tourism as a site for social inequality. Now when we try to talk and understand inequality, most of the time we understand with reference to caste, class, race, ethnic inequality. Now, how these forms of inequality kind of play when we have individuals from foreign countries coming as tourists to local places, and this becomes a site for intersection of caste, race, gender, forms of inequality. In this lecture, we are going to look into how tourism at one side is considered as a form for economic development, yet at the other side leads to kind of increase in the level of global inequality experienced by people belonging to certain ethnic background. So, we try to understand what is the relationship between tourism and global inequality. Now, when we look into tourism, it is frequently described as one of the world's fastest growing industry and a new source of wealth creation in deprived regions and less developed nations. So, most of the developing countries like Asian countries, Africa, tourism is the most important industry fostering economic growth and increase in the GDP of the country. However, emphasis on its economic benefit has been countered by increasing concern over the uneven nature of such economic development. So, much of the literature tells us about the positive side, that it is increasing the wealth because a lot of people come in from the foreign countries, they kind of purchasing certain goods and items, they are spending on the travels and hotel industry, but it does it at any time in everyday interaction also kind of lead to an inequality both at the level of economic and the social structure. So, these concerns have been expressed by academics, policymakers and practitioners and have been raised in relation to different scales: individual well-being, family structure, community development and national identity. So, a lot of focus is in terms of maintaining the cultural pride of one's nation, because it's a question of outshowing your country, your culture, your economy to outsiders. So, it's a question of national identity, and therefore, lot of investments in terms of the maintenance of sites, tourist spots, tourist places, temples, cultural heritage places are done in order to ensure both that we retain our cultural identity, at the same time it attracts more and more people to our country to boost economic development. Tourism has always been a site and a contributor to social inequality. But as tourism expands at a seemingly insatiable pace, the inequality becomes increasingly evident. So too does the need for a more complex and nuanced understanding of them. So, it's just not in terms of the economic growth or in terms of aiding to the GDP of the country, it is also to be understood in terms of the interaction of individuals, say from two different racial background, or say people coming in from the developed nation, the white fair skin versus the black underdeveloped, poverty ridden areas. So, how do the interaction takes place? Does it lead to legitimation of the power of the certain communities and racial ethnic background who are kind of assumed to be more powerful than those on the other side? Is it strengthening that hierarchy? And that is what is important to understand in order to have a more nuanced understanding of tourism as a social process. Some groups are excluded from participation in tourism as a result of socio-economic disadvantage, but exclusion and marginalization also results from discrimination, cultural prejudice and fear. Now, tourism itself is not available to everyone. It's not a question that anybody can afford to do it, because it's adds on to a kind of an expenses. So there are certain category of people who have been excluded from the being a visitor to the other country. So if someone from India wants to kind of be to a tourist or a European country or to say America, you have to have a good amount of saving in order to ensure that you are able to purchase the tickets, you are able to have your stay, and therefore it is those who are the disadvantaged, the people coming from economically background or do not have the means to spend that, are generally excluded from this. Institutional racist practices restrict ethnic minority citizens from enjoying tourism experiences to the full. Now, here we are, since it's kind of a very exhaustive area, we are going to restrict our discussion to the study of tourism and inequality in Africa. And for this, the reference or the reading that has been referred to discuss this topic is The Nervous Gauge, Backpacking in Africa. The author is Claudia Bell. She reflects on the experiences and perceptions of tourists in Africa. Now, why is she calling it as a tourist gaze? Because here, those who are coming in mainly from the developed countries, say from America, the white skin or white race, versus those who are kind of on the complete contrast. So, they are living in a poor area, economically underdeveloped, and then you have the racism of population which is largely from the black community. So, those who come in, the outsider, they look at the local as something which is going to be something that needs to be gauged or something that needs to be kind of object for entertainment of the other. So, this tourist gaze remains a key concept in tourism research. That is how the insider becomes an object of reflection for those who are coming to that country as tourists. The main objective of Claudia Bell's paper is to comprehend the theoretical and empirical development of tourist gaze notion. Most of the time we have heard of gender gaze, so similarly the concept is of a tourist gaze, and it is also reflecting on the inequality or the stratification of communities based on racial identity. This study identifies how the tourist gaze operates in different contexts and circumstances, allowing the development of a gaze theory. The gaze theory is basically also a relationship of power. Whom will you gaze? You will gaze someone who is subordinate. So, here you have the white race as considered as a dominant group who has the capacity to purchase and a ticket and come to a country for as tourist, and they are kind of important because they are going to give money to the developing nation, and therefore they are going to consider the inferior or the powerless as an object of entertainment. This article underscores the broader implication of how Africa is commodified as tourist destination, with its people and culture framed as the other, to be observed and consumed rather than engaged with as equal. And this is the most important part, that the local or those who are from Africa becomes the other. So, the Americans are going to look up at the other and kind of they are going to be consumed. So, they like becomes a commodity for consumption, and there is the coming in of inequality between people belonging to two racial background. Through this lens, Bell examines the cultural and racial inequality perpetuated in the interaction between Western tourist and African local, suggesting that even in the pursuit of authentic experiences, tourists remain bound by fear, privilege and power imbalance. So, the whole idea that most of the time why do we go to another land or another area is to have an experience of the geography, the nature, and also the culture. Now here, while you are experiencing this, the hidden unconscious play of your racial identity becomes so dominant that it is reflected in your everyday interaction. So, when we look into Africa or the tourism in Africa, there is a certain image which is there in the minds of the Western population, and they come in to visit Africa with this notion or the image of Africa in in the minds of the tourist. So, the tourist often see Africa as different or exotic, viewing locals through a lens of fear and curiosity. This creates a perception of Africa as the other, a place that is separate from the tourist everyday life. So, it kind of, why is it other? Because they are not like themselves, they are different. So, that is why the other versus ourself. So, their everyday interactions, say among the people from the same, all the tourists, they form a community, their interaction will be among the equals. But when they interact with the other, inequality comes in because the others are inferior, the others are marginalized, the others are subordinate. So, discourses of tourism in Africa have focused on two areas. One, tourism as a developing strategy for possibilities of economic expansion, and number two, as a case study to examine the impact of globalization on developing countries. Now, these mediated representation of Africa, either it is a kind of a place for economic growth, the impact of globalization, the other discourses that it is kind of also imagined as a dangerous place. And why is it dangerous? Because there is a kind of the possibility of conflict, because they are the interaction of two different community whose identities are, at many a time might contradict or kind of conflict. So, that is how it is going to shape how tourists are going to perceive and experience their surrounding. Bell, however, critiques how tourism in poorer African nations construct the local population as an other, a potential threatening subaltern. This framing not only perpetuates stereotypes but is also essential to the very structure of tourism capitalism. Now, since the place tourism is a form of consumption, it is also kind of understood as tourism capitalism, where everything is kind of considered as a commodity attached with a price, and the entire process is in terms of profit maximization. So, tourism is seen as an industry which is going to lead to economic growth, and therefore, this concept of tourism capitalism. So, in the context of travel capitalism, the concept of the other is essential. Without the presence of an other to be observed at African tourist site, there is no sense of exoticism for visitors to experience, something that tourists specifically see when traveling to different culture. So, the choice to visit another country is to experience something unique, something exotic. So, if that exotic is not there, then tourism will make no sense, or maybe the place becomes not attractive to the tourist. So, the concept of other is the most important commodity in tourist capitalism. The service class that facilitate this visit relies on the existence of this constructed other. However, the racial biases that many white Westerners carry from their upbringing are often intensified when they visit African nation. And that is what I said in the beginning, that there are certain stereotypes, there are certain notions or imaginations of a country which is underdeveloped, having a high population of a black race, and therefore the racial inequality is already there in the mind when they are coming to this, or the other way around, they feel themselves superior. Now that superiority will further get strengthened because they are the commodity which has to be sold in order to be part of that capitalism, tourist capitalism. So the purchaser, those who have the power to purchase that commodity, will take an added powerful position in this everyday interaction. The other plays a central role in the tourist experience, as African locals are needed to serve as exotic backdrop and the service providers that make the experience possible. Their presence, while necessary for tourism industry to function, reinforces a power dynamic where the local become part of the consumable experience for travelers. This dynamic highlights the inherent inequality between the visitor and the host community, with the local positioned as safe but subordinate part of the overall tourist experiences. So there are different levels of inequality or the power imbalance. One is the racial background. The other is the inequality between the traveler and the local. Now the travelers have the capacity to spend, that is they have the capital, and the local are the commodity to be consumed. So the power imbalance is again kind of creating an unequal relationship between the foreigners and the local. Now, when we look into the whole idea of the tourism capitalism, the tourist gauge, it's important to understand that all these concepts and these understanding are coming in from a branch of study which has now become important, and that is tourism studies. Tourism studies is a growing area in academia. However, the text material that sociologists examine on tourists is generally quite different from tourist everyday discussions about travel. Now, any tourist, when they go to an exotic place or to any foreign countries, would generally describe their travel, their sightseeing, what experiences that have. Now, the sociologists are not kind of just giving us the everyday narration. What they are trying to do is to understand how these narratives or how the everyday interaction structures the cultural and social relationship, and therefore the sociologist would look into where it is creeping in inequality or is it kind of strengthening a further egalitarian relation. And the example includes that the recolonization of indigenous people and their employment in the subservient roles to please the needs of tourists, the exacerbation of the concept of other as object of the tourist gaze. These are some of the topics that have been part of the tourism studies, and there are now there's lot of academic discussions, lot of academic investigation on the kind of how the local interact with the foreign, how you kind of get labeled as the other, how you also can kind of change your display, your everyday exhibition of your culture, of your lifestyle to the foreigners in order to increase that gauge. It is the tourist gauge that is going to increase the income of the locals, and therefore they also transform themselves. They become like an object on display so that the tourists are pleased and they will be able to spend from their pockets. So, these topics are still largely to be the domain of tourism research, and it is not kind of part of everyday common tourist discourse. The popular press travel pages or television travel shows do not carry out any such analysis. Their agendas are to drive tourism and to encourage consumer participation in travel capitalism. Often airlines, resorts and tourism bureau sponsored the idiom. In short, they are advertising. So nowadays we see a lot of advertisements on certain area Why are these advertisements done? These advertisements are part of that travel capitalism, that it is going to kind of gives you a great idea that yes, this is a place for exotic experience, or it is a place which could give you a lot of satisfaction if you travel. And in a way it is kind, so just as any product of everyday use is advertised, the tourist places are advertised, and it kind of attracts more and more people to visit that place. Marketing and management provides model for some approaches in tourism scholarship. Tourism as a development strategy in African country, most commentators consider that the African continent has unreached potential. So, all earlier, most of the studies tourism would be, say, the developed nations, because people would have a taste to visit this. Now there is a reversal in the sense that people want to go to places which has not been explored, which has not been traveled, so that they have a different story to narrate, or they have a different kind of experience. And this is when the whole idea of linking tourism to inequality appeared as in a kind of an area which need to be explored within tourism studies. Now, the entire focus of the article was to understand the construction of an imagination or of an image of Africa in the Western media. So, the fundamental obstacle to tourism in Africa is the image of the continent. Africa has a particular and a special form of inequality due to media depiction and racism. Appudurai, in his work, refers to the concept of mediascape, that is, the place in which public concepts are constituted and transformed. So, the media creates its own narrative, or the media creates its own story, and it kind of circulates among the people. So, it is a kind of different narration which could have been part of the place, but since it is articulated in the media, there is a larger audience to it, and therefore, this narrative is considered as more legitimate. Mediascapes are both the global distributive capacity to produce and disseminate information and the global image of the world presented through the increasing range and forms of media. The large complex images and narratives presented to the world blur the lines between fiction and reality. As legends, they may be true, they are taken up quickly before factual counter narratives can surface. So, the media has a very popular role, and it's kind of a very strong dominated position. It creates a story, it creates a narrative which is considered to be true. So, when we kind of look into tourism studies and the images created, it's important to understand the researcher who is going to study that place is also a tourist. So, you are going to another country to understand it as a tourist place, and the most effective way to understand tourism as a site for inequality is through participant observation. That is, you immerse yourself in the daily life of the subject being studied. And this has been considered as the most valuable method to understand both the travelers and the local people. And only by direct participation in the lives of these tourists as well as the local, there can be a understanding of the hidden reality. So, the method enabled a more authentic understanding of the tourist motivations and behavior, and the tourist experience are shaped by mixed encounters, popular discourses, speculative idea, and that is how it kind of leads to a more detailed understanding. But then there is a critique to the participant observer in terms of lacking certain scientific, but it is the way to understand the interaction between the foreigners and the local. So, tourism, especially in remote disadvantaged area, highlights a deep irony. It is largely the affluent who can afford to visit this area, and it creates a area for unequal interaction in everyday life. This is an understanding of the relation between tourism and inequality. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.